DC has the second highest child poverty rate in the country. One concrete way to support these children and their families is to subsidize childcare. In DC, the childcare subsidy program has been cut $30 million in the past 4 years, leaving many families without a slot in childcare, jeopardizing their employment and ability to become self-sufficient. In Ward 1 alone, there are nearly 3,000 children on a wait list for child care, including more than 1,000 infants and toddlers. What will you do about this? Mr. Graham, you can start.
Well, when you're in a tight budget, you can do one of two things. You can cut, or you can find new revenue. My answer in this budget just approved, and in last year's budget, was to find new revenue. And where I wanted to find it was to increase the tax, actually to restore the prior level of tax rate on income taxes for people who make $1 million in taxable income a year. That would have produced $17 million, which would have been available for Save Our Safety Net, would have been available for child care, would have been available for rent supplement, TANF, emergency housing assistance. We had, with the efforts of a lot of people in this room who were part of this, some of them weren't, of course, we didn't hear too much from my opponents on this, but when we were struggling to get the millionaires tax into place, we got 5 votes this year. Last year we got 1 vote, and it was me, you know that. This year we got 5 votes. And when the revenue estimates come back in the fall, I'm going to be right there with the millionaires tax again and saying this message. Those who have the most should help those who have the least. You should not have the same tax level at $40,000 as you do at $1 million. They just don't make any sense. So let's restore the tax rate to the 2004 levels. Let's get $17 million in the first year, more than that in subsequent years, so that we can really protect poor people in this city.
Thank you. I must say that I disagree with Mr. Graham's plan, especially when it comes to the $1 million tax. One thing that we've seen in D.C. is that those people that are making over a certain amount, $250,000 or more, are tired of the tax burden. So what are they doing? They're automatically moving out of the city. They're moving into Virginia. So then again, what happens? It falls back on you. It falls back on me. You know, one of the things that Mr. Graham can talk about is why don't we find a way to collect some of the $9 million in uncollected fees owed to the city of D.C. These are people who live in D.C. who don't register their vehicles. These are landlords who are renting property who don't have the proper business license. These are people who owe taxes and fees back to the city. You know, a regulatory system in place to bring that $9 million or collect that $9 million back to the city helps or it raises taxes on individuals like you and I. When it goes back to the child care issue, that's something that we need to invest into. One of the things that I propose is that the city needs to definitely look at building public-private partnerships. Money coming into the city. Progressive cities have seen this for years. We've seen outside funding coming into the city to help offset some of the taxpayer dollars and taxpayer wages. It's a simple process. It's very easy. Before we talk about imposing another tax or another fee or another regulation, I think it's incumbent upon this administration, upon this D.C. Council, to open its eyes and look outside of D.C. on how we can bring new money into the city.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you. Well, we know child care is one of the biggest obstacles to employment for people, particularly people, families, and lower wage income earners. And I think here in Washington, D.C., we've been reimbursing public child care providers at about 30% of the market rate. The law actually requires us to reimburse them at least 70%. We're still using 2004 figures for setting those reimbursement rates here in 2010. There's no wonder a lot more private daycare providers don't want to provide these subsidies to people and their families when the government is charged with reimbursing them. We're also leaving eligibility with Department of Human Services when funding comes from OSSI. So there's a disconnect in who's determining that level of services. I think those are some of the things that could help even the burden and the demand as it relates to working class families here in the city. But when it comes to revenue, politicians like to talk about what they propose all the time or what they introduce. But where the rubber hits the road is the evidence is in what they're able to get their colleagues to support. My council member here on Ward 1 was able to get his colleagues to support that $8.5 million rebate I just talked to you about for his rent. What I failed to mention is on December 16th, after he introduced that rebate for millionaire developers, I guess these are some of the millionaires you're saying should be taxed more, and I agree, they should be. 6 days later, he took thousands of dollars in re-election money from them. So clearly, they didn't need a bailout from these people. That's money being wasted by the city. We've let the city council constantly, the city council has let the city overspend in some areas like SYEP, for instance, which is overspent. Summer youth employment programs have overspent by tens of millions of dollars. And that's money that could have been invested in some of this workforce investment that we talked about earlier, not just simply paying millions of dollars over the budget to let kids walk through the street and pick up garbage in the heat. These are things that produce revenue that could have saved some of these very important programs that we've seen reduced in recent years.
I always find it very unfortunate when we end up having nonprofits that actually do this better than the city does. Jubilee Jumpstart has a program right now for Jubilee residents where they provide childcare for any resident within Jubilee housing, 24-hour-a-day childcare. So that any family that has somebody that's working overnight, single parents don't have to make a decision about staying home with their kids or losing their job. It's an amazing program, and you start to see this duplicated throughout the city. The SED centers, the Spanish Educational Development Center, is doing something very similar. They're also coupling these with job creation programs, trying to give people training. These are like amazing programs, and while the city does help them to some degree, we obviously need more programs that are like this. When you're talking about $17 million that we needed to from the millionaire's tax to save our safety net, someone making $40,000 in Washington, D.C., if they have 4 children, or if it's a family of 4 and they're making $40,000, they're categorized by AMI as living in an extreme poverty. Very below the poverty. $40,000 in Washington, D.C. ain't what it used to be. That those people are being taxed at a rate that is 8.5 to 8.9% is pretty significant. And so instead of just throwing something at the millionaire's tax, which I think sounds great, and I think most people would be on board because it's easy to go after Chris Donatelli and say that guy should be paying more taxes, particularly he has, several $1,000s to kick to Councilmember Graham. Then what we should be looking at is the people at the lowest end of that $40,000 and redo the entire code. That's what we have to do, because someone at $40,000 who's paying over 8% of their income in taxes, it seems to be pretty significantly high, especially if they're in extreme poverty. And if you judge that and go in the other direction, the shift could happen so that some people are going to be paying less and other people are going to be paying more, and try to make the revenue, and not just something that's sort of gimmicky that's only going to win us $5 million.
Tell him, Brian. Tell him.